Okay, so we requested a report last year on how other states fund municipal infrastructure. And that beeping sound is real, right? Okay, good, stop.
Just stop.
Ted Barnett from JFO is almost done with the report and wants to share a presentation with us before finalizes the report. And I'm really excited about it. Thank you. Come on.
For the record, Ted Barnett, Joint Fiscal Office. I'm excited to be back in the chair again. So here we go. I'm going to share my screen and hope I remembered how to do all of the technology. All right, here we are. So yes, as the chair mentioned, our office was tasked with doing a report on how municipalities fund public infrastructure, some of the intersections between state and federal funding for public infrastructure, and finally kind of looking at how other states creatively fund infrastructure for municipalities or kind of help them build capacity and complete these projects. So our outline is, first of all, looking at the statutory charge behind the report, and like any good report, starting with some definitional challenges, and then looking at kind of a brief overview of funding sources. Our goal in the report was not to provide catalogs of everything out there. There are folks who've done great work in this area. We're going to talk a little bit about the challenges, and then finally exploring programs that are already in existence in Vermont that are tackling some of these challenges, and then also looking at the regional and state level and seeing how other folks are doing this. So our statutory charge, I have to move my windows here. So we were charged with including or working on a report that included these three pieces. First, looking at public infrastructure funding programs in other states and municipalities that could be implemented in Vermont. Recommendations for aligning state and federal assistance for public infrastructure, and finally, recommendations for harmonizing or expanding existing programs and the distribution of funding. I will say this report really focuses on this first bullet and looking at other programs. Specifically, the world is really broad, and we thought this is the place where JFO could make kind of really contribute to the conversation. So starting with what do we mean by infrastructure? I think everyone has something that like pops into their brain when they think about it. The core definition is roads, bridges, water and sewer infrastructure, the stuff that, you know, we don't really notice it until it breaks or doesn't work in the way we want it to. And more recently at the federal level, the Biden administration in their Build Back Better framework added people-powered infrastructure to this definition. And so they talked about childcare, elder care being a part of these things that are in our lives day to day. Connected to that, we talked about this in the report. I think this led to an interesting nexus by which a town in South Dakota, Madison, used a tax increment financing district to fund the development of a childcare center. And so this is a neat way that, you know, we're looking at a broader definition of infrastructure and using an economic development tool to get there. For the purposes of the report, we borrowed the definition of improvements from the chapter that governs tax increment financing districts. And so improvements in this case means the installation, new construction, or reconstruction of infrastructure that serves a public purpose. And these categories include transportation, utilities, public facilities, amenities, land and property acquisition, demolition, and site preparation. And within this broader definition, we narrowed it down to kind of remove the pieces that we felt like were covered in other areas. So within utilities, we didn't really look at broadband. They have their own sources of funding and they're being deployed through CUDs, and there's a lot of progress in that area. Transportation, a lot of the road networks and bridges, these obviously are dealt with in transportation committees through the NLT bill. And so we're looking at stuff that more commonly is it's more local, streetscaping, multimodal pedestrian improvements, recreation trails, things that promote economic development within towns. And then finally, we obviously do not look at school funding through the education fund in the public facilities and amenities piece.
Yeah, but this does include sewer and water?
Yes, definitely. And throughout the report, we spend a lot of time on sewer and water infrastructure because that is kind of the necessary condition to do housing development, to bring in new businesses, and a lot of towns lack that infrastructure.
And you didn't have a definition of municipality.
Municipality, that's a great question. And we will use kind of, I forget, there's a recommendation, but municipality means kind of any town, city or town. There are other, like CUDs are municipal kind of construction, but we don't consider those.
I didn't understand exactly when you said public facilities and amenities does not include school funding through the education fund. Can you explain that again?
Sure. We just, in the context of the report, we didn't consider the education fund simply because that's Julia. It's got a whole other kind of world and sources of funding. And so we wanted to look at things like a town hall or libraries or things that would be funded more at the municipal level.
So you're meaning school building funding?
Correct. Yes.
I thought you might have meant using the education fund as a source of.
No, that is not the intention for sure, but I can make sure that's abundantly clear in the report. So moving on to our high risk overview of current funding sources at the local level. Obviously, there's local tax revenue and local bonding. The Vermont Bond Bank is a huge player in this space. They have a cool dashboard that shows you all the infrastructure projects they've done since 2000, and the total is over $1.2 billion worth of bonding. Some of this is kind of the public amenity, and some of it does include school buildings, but it's a huge amount of money that they've contributed. And then another big piece of local funding currently is local ARPA funds. So municipalities directly received $200 million in fiscal relief funds. Towns were really thoughtful in how they approached these funds, created committees, and many of these towns decided to spend a piece to upgrade some portions of their infrastructure. And the key part here is that these funds have to be obligated by the end of 2024. And then out to the state level, again, want to flag that this is not an exhaustive list, but DEC contributes on, wastewater and clean water front. They are kind of on the engineering side of our clean and drinking water revolving loan funds. I just want to mention here, Vermont Bond Bank and VITA contribute the funding for this for public entities. So the plan is created by engineers, and then they move on to the bond bank or VITA to kind of test the financial capacity of the plan. And so those entities do that work with those two funds. AOT contributes a lot of bike and pedestrian multimodal funding through the Transportation Alternatives Program, the Bike and Pedestrian Program, Recreational Trail Program, and others. And then ACCD obviously is on the community and economic development side. They have a downtown sales tax allocation program. Obviously, TIFs are a big part of this conversation as well. The Brownfield Revitalization Funds Loan Program. And then kind of outside of these big buckets, I wanted to mention a few other programs. The Agency Administration has a Municipal Technical Assistance Program, which I'll talk about in more depth later. BGS funds municipal building energy improvements. The state infrastructure bank provides revolving loan fund for roads, bridges, and large transportation infrastructure. And VITA, as I mentioned earlier, provides revolving loan funding through the clean and drinking water programs, and also for a wide range of other economic development programs. And then, of course, could not neglect huge pieces of federal legislation. ARPA collectively, in addition, like between the $200 million directly to municipalities, 1.05 billion was allocated to Vermont. And of that, the state authorized $30 million for water infrastructure programs. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the IIJA or BIL, there's $550 billion of funding that's allocated outside of their normal formula funding process. And so these include things like $1.5 billion nationally for brownfields, an extra $44 billion for our state clean and drinking water revolving loan programs. And Chris added a note here that there are many restrictions, so these aren't the most flexible funds that folks can access. And then there are also federal agencies that are directly involved. The Northern Border Regional Commission. Sorry, my banner is right in the way. Provides funding for economic and community development projects in interior New England. In fiscal year 23, their Catalyst program gave entities in each state $11 million. And these are various chunks for infrastructure and economic development projects. And the USDA Rural Development, they have made investments primarily in the form of loans that average $130 million per year in the state of Vermont. So federal agencies obviously play a part as well. And so the challenge really comes, unfortunately, there's rarely a single funding source that meets the full needs of an infrastructure project. And so projects have to build a capital stack. And this is kind of layering all of your different pieces of funding together to get you to the threshold that meets the projected costs of a project. And a technical piece here, these funds in a capital stack can either be blended or braided. And so blending means funds can be pooled together and reported on together. And it's a little easier to manage those funds. And braided funding, they kind of layer on each other and have to be reported on separately.
I have never seen anyone define those two terms before.
You're welcome. I had to figure it out. I'd heard it a lot of times and I was like, wait a second, what does this mean? And so I wanted to show an example capital stack to see how one project put this together. So this is the water system improvements in Killington. The biggest piece of this is their tax increment financing. It's $47 million. ACCD is the lead on tax increment financing. There's the state ARPA funds through the Village Water and Wastewater Initiative. They have $2.3 million. Revolving loan funds, $3.7 million. And then MBRC added another $3 million in grants. And so there's federal funding here, there's state funding, loan funding, there's state grant funding, you have bonding through tax increment financing. And so it really shows how a project really has to do work to put all of this together. And it takes a long time to kind of get the pieces working together. And this kind of flows into our discussion of some of the challenges. This is kind of a smaller look. I'm sure, towns and cities could contribute to challenges and things they find frustrating. But really wanted to lead with three here: capacity, resources, in this final piece. I borrowed this term, political economy. On the capacity side, data from the Agency of Administration, they found that more than 100 towns don't have a manager or an administrator. So the person who would be the point person managing funds, assembling funds, getting folks ready to implement projects. 100 towns don't have that point person kind of playing the role of organizing everything. And even if towns do have administrative staff, it's really hard to put together and manage a capital stack. So a project with 5 different braided sources of funding may have 5 different reporting requirements and different grant financial management requirements. This is mentioning Davis-Bacon is from my previous life in a business office. I had one grant that was under Davis-Bacon requirements, which required extensive reporting on how folks are getting paid, and some that didn't. Some funding sources applied. We had 2 buildings, applied to both of them. One applied to only one of them. And so for folks managing these projects, it can get really complicated really quickly. And then just the town size in Vermont makes it really hard to access federal funding. A lot of opportunities are designed for communities with more than 50,000 people, or that's kind of where it starts becoming available for folks. In Vermont, we have a city that can do that.
Thank you for saying all of that I know my town's experience and are frustrated by when they make. So glad that we'll have a report that emphasizes all that together.
Of course, yes, it's really challenging. And so that's just the capacity piece. I also wanted to talk about fiscal resources here. Because of the scale of projects, right? It a lot of times requires a lot of users and this is diving into water and sewer infrastructure. The small scale of projects means that even technically feasible and what engineers think is the right solution for a community are expensive. And so this is from Grafton received funding to implement a wastewater system. And these are figures come from their 60% design report. And so for 97 equivalent residential units, so a single family home would be an equivalent residential unit. The probable cost for that system was a little bit above $8 million. State ARPA funds contributed almost $4 million of that. The amount to be financed, this is including a little bit of contingency in case there are overages, was a little over $5 million. And so you have this amount to be financed. The EPA has affordability criteria. And so they want the cost for one of these single family homes to be less than 2% of the area median income when the project is operational. And so what that would mean is that the single family home would pay about $1,400 per year for their sewer system to the town. When you crunch the numbers, the actual cost is $3,500. And so these just don't connect. And so in order to make that system affordable, the project would have to be entirely grant funded. So that's finding an extra $5 million. And so, yes, there just is a lot of resources required to get a technically feasible system to reality. And then finally, the political economy piece is talking about projects can still have the funding they need, can be well designed, can be almost ready for completion, but they still face this final challenge of folks in the town have to agree that this is the right fit for them. And so the example is Westford. Grant funding would have paid for 100% of the project. And the town held a bond vote they wanted to provide a backstop of $400,000 in bond capacity if there were any sort of overages, just contingencies to make sure they weren't stuck with a hole at the end of the project, and the bond vote failed.
And if anyone would like to learn more about what that felt like, I am available.
Sure. Yes.
It was not fun.
Right. And it's not, and using these examples of Grafton and Westford, I'm not trying to single anyone out, right? It's just talking about the challenges inherent in infrastructure is really challenging. Yeah. Just looking at a website that was unified against or a website that talked about some of the no vote reasons, or, there were folks who were concerned that infrastructure development would bring too much growth to their downtown and around the Village Green. And also concerns that, the town would be everyone in the town would be responsible for maintaining a system that was in the center of town. Yes, so capacity, resources, and political economy, and getting that all lined up is kind of like getting your stars completely aligned. So there are solutions. one area. And so in this section, looking at different levels of engagement, right? You can really help improve capacity at the local level, engage at the regional level, or, there are other state programs. So starting with, a program that's attempting to build local capacity, the Agency of Administration has $3 million for the Municipal Technical Assistance Program. And so they started by building a Vermont Community Index, and this looks at towns' capacity in need. And so as of October 2023, communities that scored in, the 50 percentile or above in needs, and communities slightly lower in need and capacity, but had, significant needs from the floods were eligible to participate in this program. And so they contracted, the Agency of Administration, with a regional planning commission and Vermont League and Cities and Towns to work with towns and build their capacity and help them find funding sources, and help them access and apply for different funding sources. And since I figured everyone would potentially want to see the scores in their community, put them up in here. And quite a bit. So the higher the darker the color, the higher the need. And there's quite a bit of variability in this map. So I appreciated that they also looked at a wider geographic region. The darker greens here in the center of the state is the Randolph labor market area. Labor market areas in the Northeast Kingdom.
If you point with your
with my mouse. Here we are. Yes. So Randolph here, and then Northeast Kingdom, and then this tiny green here is an extension of the North Adams labor market area. And VLCT has a federal funding assistance program. They've provided a lot of guidance on ARPA reporting and compliance. There's a federal funding guidebook if you want to read 118 pages on different funding sources available to municipalities. It is available. I should send it in a link. It's a great resource. And they've had over 250 direct one-on-one interactions with municipalities. And those are interactions that municipalities would have had to work with a consultant on, for example. So at the regional level, outside of New England, county governments do a large share of infrastructure development. So I was home in Florida over Christmas, and the newspaper was talking about all of the things the county was doing. They were building a new aquatic park. They were doing kind of larger projects. And so the county that I grew up in is 400,000 people. And so this is a structure that has resources and capacity to implement infrastructure programs. And counties only provide limited services in Vermont. So public safety, judicial services. And this is where regional planning commissions have entered, and they provide a lot of technical assistance to municipalities, particularly around land use planning, clean water, environmental remediation, and some assistance in grant writing. In one place where the legislature has expanded that capacity is in Act 47 in 2023. This is the HOME Act. They provided $300,000 to the Vermont Association of Planning and Development Authorities to hire housing resource navigators, so connecting municipalities and housing organizations with funding sources, and provided some project management assistance. So again, we're getting at the capacity piece to help municipalities access more resources. So that was at the local and regional level. I'll provide some examples of other state programs. In infrastructure, the first one is other revolving loan programs. In discussions of infrastructure, a lot of times folks propose that there should be some sort of revolving loan fund for public infrastructure. And Vermont already has a few of these, right? There's a clean water revolving loan fund program. Drinking water has a revolving loan fund program, and other areas have them as well. The ones that Vermont have are often capitalized by federal funding. The EPA provides it, but the loans have to be repaid back. New Mexico has a public project revolving fund, and this program is funded through a 75% contribution of the state's governmental gross receipts tax, which is levied on water, sewer, and trash services. And repayments of outstanding loans contribute to the pool as well. That's the revolving piece. And in fiscal year 22, almost $250 million of investments came out of the fund. The loans are available at a market rate or a 2% subsidized rate for disadvantaged communities. When thinking about a revolving loan fund program, you have two main questions. First, where are the capitalizing funds going to come from? And then also thinking about the scope and size of investments from the fund. If you have $20 million, for example, you can make $21 million contributions to an infrastructure project, or you can really make larger catalyzing investments in a few. And there's that trade-off in kind of thinking about how the fund might be constructed. And then also when making those loans, there has to be some sort of infrastructure to evaluate the creditworthiness of who's borrowing and making sure that the loans will be paid back.
There's also the fact that the towns need to find the capacity to pay the loan back.
Exactly. Yes. And in addition, I only presented a subset of the available funding opportunities. Creating a revolving loan fund is just another place that municipalities would have to apply to and get accepted. So it could increase the complexity of the funding landscape.
Yeah.
Maybe you'll get to this, but did you see any programs that had like revolving loans with TA, lender and raters who are there to not only provide the funds, but help people access them and build that capital stack?
I didn't see any specifically. The specific one in New Mexico sits within the New Mexico Financing Authority. I think that's finance something. And so there would be some technical expertise to help folks, but there's not an explicit kind of call out that resource is available. Yeah. The next other state program that kind of we are going to talk about in the report is this concept of tax-based sharing. So in Minnesota, there's a fiscal disparities program that was created in the 1970s, and it collects a portion of the tax-based growth from the base year of 1971. And that gets moved into an area pool that's then shared between communities. And these allocations depend on the community's population and relative property tax base per capita. I'm going to leave it at there. If there's more interest in this model, I can talk about the nuts and bolts of how it's implemented. It's complicated. In 2023, the program shared $531 million of taxable value. That's 34% of the commercial and industrial tax base between municipalities in the Twin Cities metro area. So the fiscal disparities program in Minnesota, there's one around the Twin Cities metro, and then there's another in the Iron Range, which is a more rural part of Minnesota. In the Twin Cities metro area, 107 communities received contributions and 72 contributed to the pool. This program isn't specifically tied to infrastructure. Communities can use these contributions in any way they'd like, but they could use it, and it's very likely that they have used it to augment their investments in their local infrastructure.
And so, yeah. Could you just go back for a second?
Sure.
Thank you. I'm a little confused about 107 communities received contributions from the area-wide pool of 72 that made contributions. So I'm imagining like a metro with however many.
It says and.
Okay, I'm still confused. So how many municipalities are there overall in that metro? And why would they not all contribute? Is it?
There's a key.
If it's just too weedy, that's totally okay.
No, it's a great question. I should have used the phrase on net.
Okay.
Yes, and so on net, the 107 communities, they're all contributing, and the 107 received more than their share, and 72 contributed a little bit more than what they gave in. Yes.
I like the ed fund.
Kind of like the Ed Fund. My next slide, I was going to say, is technically complicated to design, implement, and monitor. You basically need a Julia, right? Like that is the comparison. Yes.
You had to understand in there.
And understand, yes. Exactly. So yes, if there is interest in this type of program, I could definitely do a whole other kind of breakdown of the steps that go into determining the contribution, who gets things on net. They're different. There's an area-wide pool tax rate and how that's calculated for another time.
I think what's interesting about this piece isn't necessarily how it's funded, but how it's dispersed. And that it's not about sort of ability to jump through hoops. It is about ability to raise revenue on your own or at community's need level. And so I think, as we're sort of hearing about all of these, I'm going to be thinking about sort of like which pieces from which states seem like they would work here and which pieces seem like they would be a nightmare here. The sort of complicated paying in seems like we have enough of that going on. But the idea that communities wouldn't have to apply and would in fact receive revenue, if we were going to design a revenue sharing system, which I think has been proposed a bunch of times, I think that system for sharing out might be really effective. So just like, imagine we're going to have a report that's a grab bag and we don't have to take each piece as it is. We can puzzle piece things together. And I like that piece of that. Anyway, sorry, back to you.
Of course. And so in addition to the technical piece of understanding, designing, implementing, and monitoring the program, there are communities involved. To the extent there is any sort of revenue sharing, communities are likely to be very interested in who is a winner and who is a loser, right? And so managing kind of those expectations in this type of program is very challenging.
We all win.
We all win.
Equity and everyone thrives.
Exactly. I also wanted to talk about efforts in other states to create dedicated authorities and dedicated authorities. In South Carolina, they have a rural infrastructure authority. And so this is basically the one-stop shop if you're doing water infrastructure in South Carolina. They manage ARPA funding. They have a common application for all state water infrastructure grants. They also have some technical capacity assistance in helping access funding. And so this is the Department of Environmental Conservation in Vermont does similar work in water projects, and they do a lot of coordinating with folks who are implementing water infrastructure projects. But in South Carolina, they've really advertised themselves as kind of the central clearinghouse for these types of projects. I also wanted to introduce a program in Massachusetts that's called the Community One Stop for Growth. And this is a common application for 12 programs across 3 different agencies in Massachusetts. A lot of these are economic development focused and housing focused. And so making sure that sites are ready to go. And so all a program has to do is complete this one application, and then the One Stop for Growth program evaluates them according to this development continuum. And so the different funding sources that are available are connected to where they fall in this continuum. So if the program is in the planning and zoning stage, that unlocks a certain kind of portion of funding, but communities don't really have to think as much about where they fall in this continuum. It's done on the back end.
In this scenario, so was the other state North Carolina that you just did?
South Carolina.
South Carolina.
Yeah.
So in South Carolina, I hear that sort of the blending and braiding happens both at the application level and at the monitoring level. And I imagine that here it happens at the application level, but not at the monitoring level. Is that right?
I will check on that to confirm before I say anything, but that's my sense.
Knowing both of those pieces of it are helpful.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful.
And then actually the disbursement level, so those sort of like 3 stages.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and yes, I'm not entirely sure at the disbursement level what the monitoring looks like for this, but I will follow up.
I'm sorry, you probably already said this. This is a state agency managed process
Yes, this is at the state level.
within who?
I don't know off the top of my head. Yes, there are these three. So it is between the Executive Office of Economic Development, Mass Development, and the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, but I don't know who's the central point person.
Representative Bodie.
Slides back. Thank, um, switch back again.
And Representative Bodie, I'm realizing that we have a couple slides left, and only 10 minutes, so.
Okay, so your question.
Yeah, go for it.
All right, other state programs, state tax sharing, is that commercial industrial? Okay, that answered it. I was gonna ask if they divided residential from commercial and industrial.
They do, yes.
So, but that's commercial industrial, but that's not non-resident, but that's not non-resident, well, that is non-residential. But that, does that include like rental properties and, second homes and all that?
Minnesota looks at it slightly differently than us. I can provide what falls into different tax bases for you,
Yeah.
just to confirm the distinctions, yes.
Thanks. A nonprofit and any impact of the nonprofit, those who don't pay any property taxes. Yeah.
Okay, yep, I can look into that.
I know in the Minnesota system, the number of properties that are nonprofits and aren't is part of what was part of their sort of weighting system
Have a rating system.
in Minnesota, not in Massachusetts.
Yes, and there's kind of a calculation of the property tax wealth per capita, and that's, part of the weighting that they're looking at.
Yes.
This can probably wait till you're done.
So let's do that.
Great, sure. So yes, the spending a little bit of time with this development continuum. This one's the development community continuum is looking at, this is really geared towards housing projects and kind of like public facility construction. And so, they look at starting at the community activation and placemaking. So getting community buy-in for a project to begin with at the start, which is helpful. And then go through all of the necessary planning and zoning steps. Site preparation means dealing with any sort of environmental contaminants, making sure that it meets kind of zoning requirements. And then the second piece is actually getting to the catalyzing of specific projects, whether this is commercial, industrial, residential investment and housing units that kind of meet that vision that was built with the community activation and placemaking piece. And so some closing thoughts. Really, there's a wide landscape of funding opportunities in Vermont federally for municipalities to do infrastructure, but many towns in Vermont lack the capacity to access them. If they're, in looking at infrastructure development, who really owns the responsibility for making these things happen? Is it within municipalities? Is it at the county level, or is it at the state level? And thinking about, I think that question is like, is there a way to get municipalities to the place where they're routinely kind of operating at this level where they're doing infrastructure projects, or is that just simply too big of an ask for them? And so those are my closing thoughts. The report will come out on January 15th. And so it'll be available for you all to read then, but this is the preview of where we're at so far.
Thank you. I'm really excited that we're starting to tackle this conversation in a holistic way. I think thus far we've had a lot of there's all of the grants that are floating around and we know those problems. And then we have local option taxes and we have TIFs and that's sort of like those are the things. And most of those are really like square peg round hole solutions and problems. And so I'm excited for us to work on tackling that. Representative Bodie.
With the first,
Thank you. Okay.
do you have any place where a state has, maybe you said this in a different slide when I was thinking about something else, but where a state has created an office to help figure out what funds there are and bring them in, and then also to work with the towns and cities? Don't imagine most towns and cities just can't figure out how to get the money and so forth, don't even know it's there. But to maximize money that already exists. Is any state doing?
I don't know of any state that has done kind of a broad level across all of the areas of infrastructure. I know, for example, in the South Carolina with their Rural Infrastructure Authority, they really made them the clearinghouse for water infrastructure and applying for federal sources and doing that piece. So there's two different ways of whether you're going to look at this in a specific type of infrastructure and kind of help provide the resources at that level, or whether you want to look at infrastructure more holistically. The second piece of that question, I think, is that going back to the discussion of counties, in many other states, the county is the piece that does a lot of the work of infrastructure development. So it's not putting the onus on cities and towns to know about federal sources and implement them and kind of have that technical capacity. And in many places, right, like counties have a decent population size, so they have the kind of strength to do that and have folks who are both applying for and handling the grant requirements for federal grants. And so that solves a lot of the problem of asking small cities and towns to do that work.
Representative Demrow, Maslin, Taylor, and then we're going to lunch, and maybe we'll. Please.
Thanks, Ted. Thanks I'm really glad we're having this conversation and thinking about this. Do we know yet how that money is going to filter down to the state of Vermont from the IIJA? Is it going to be in the form of, matching money for clean water projects, or is it going to, do you have any sense of that?
From my understanding, half of it is the traditional formula funding for highways, roads, bridges, kind of the larger infrastructure pieces. The other half is allocated to specific grant funding opportunities. I had a brief kind of email exchange with VLCT. They're really the experts on federal funding. So I would encourage, I had a brief interaction with them, and what they said is that a lot of the stuff in the IIJA is designed for municipalities at that 50,000 population or greater. And so it isn't as available to us, but the other half of the IIJA is allocated for various grant funding opportunities, and that included the brownfields money, $44 billion for state clean and drinking water revolving loan funds. So there are some pieces that are available.
And this is also another place where our county government puts us at a disadvantage on our money.
Exactly.
Nope, it's Jim.
Yeah, maybe a question for later, but I'm curious about the Northern Border Commission. Where do they come from? Where do they get the money? How do they decide who gets it? How that's, that's the number of minutes in itself, so maybe we don't do that right now. But I realize that they're a player here and shouldn't be overlooked. So I'm just curious about that.
Yes, they are a federal state partnership, and their funding comes from congressional appropriations.
Let's talk,
Yes.
we're gonna go
Right.
later. Yep.
I just have to say, because of the work I've done this summer regarding mobile home parks, that the same problems are being reflected in those. And they are not municipalities, but they do own their own infrastructure often and are meeting the same kind of challenges. And the reason why I asked about the municipalities specifically was because one mobile home park has become a municipality. And the size of some of those parks is greater than Grafton that you illustrated. So it's an issue that is also confronting our mobile home parks as well. And they're not included in municipal bond opportunities and things that, or being able to tax things like that. So it's an added challenge that would be good to address.
I did think it was very interesting that they were bucking the trend of there over time have been fewer villages in Vermont. And I thought it was interesting that they went and created a new one, but it is a way to add extra funding resources to an area.
So do they fit in as a municipality in your definition?
If they are an incorporated village, I don't have a specific definition of municipality, so don't want to wade into that.
Okay,
But
that's
yes,
fine.
they do, as a village, they do have abilities to kind of access greater resources.
Smallest. Am I correct that 50,000, no city in Vermont is 50,000, so we don't get any of that money.
So it's not a clear, the 50,000 was thought of as more of a like capacity, like once you get to 50,000 as a city, you're more likely to be able to get there. It's not a hard and fast cutoff. So Burlington is a city that's kind of approaching that size and would be able to operate on that scope, but it's not a clear on off at 50,000.
Thank you. We're clearly all really excited about your report and we're gonna have many more conversations about this. So,
Great.
yeah, can't wait to read it.
I'm glad there's a lot of excitement.
Thank you.
It was a fun time.
We will be back here